The golden age of Hollywood sold the world a fantasy. Perfect leading men, perfect leading ladies, perfect romances played out on the biggest screens on earth. What the studios never sold, what they worked overtime to bury, was the truth running just beneath the surface of all of it. Because while audiences fell in love with carefully scripted love stories, a different kind of love story was playing out behind closed doors. In the most glamorous industry on the planet, some of the most powerful, most beautiful, and most magnetic women who ever lived were choosing each other. And the studios knew. They arranged marriages to cover it, hired fixers to manage it, and buried the evidence for decades. But history doesn't stay buried forever. These are the couples classic Hollywood never wanted you to know about. 12 relationships, 12 stories, all of them real. And none of them were ever supposed to see the light. 1. Alla Nazimova and Mercedes de Acosta. Every underground needs a founder. In Hollywood, that founder was a Russian-born silent film star named Alla Nazimova. At her peak, she was earning $13,000 a week on a 5-year contract with Metro Pictures in 1917. More than Mary Pickford. She was brilliant, magnetic, and completely uninterested in hiding who she was. It was Nazimova who coined the phrase, the sewing circle, a discrete code word for a group of lesbian and queer actors operating at the center of Hollywood society. She turned her Sunset Boulevard mansion into the legendary Garden of Allah, a compound with its own rules, its own rituals, and a black C-shaped pool where the regular rules of Hollywood didn't apply. And the woman who moved most freely through that world was Mercedes de Acosta, a poet, a playwright, and by every account, the most prolific seducer in the history of the industry. De Acosta's documented affairs included Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Isadora Duncan, Eva Le Gallienne, and Nazimova herself. 2 of the most powerful women in the hidden world, drawn together at the very center of the network they were both quietly running. Whatever passed between them, it set the tone for everything that followed. And what followed was one of the most dramatic, hidden love stories Hollywood has ever seen. 2. Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich claimed for decades that they had never met. But according to well-researched historical accounts, they did far more than meet. They appeared together in the same German film and began an affair that ended in heartbreak. Garbo, the younger of the two, fell hard. Dietrich, older and far less sentimental, treated it as a fling, and then made it worse by gossiping about it all over town. After that, Garbo demanded absolute secrecy from every woman she became involved with going forward. The two then went on to become the biggest female stars in Hollywood and publicly denied ever crossing paths. The cover story ran for years. Legend held that Orson Welles first introduced them in 1945 at a party in Los Angeles, decades after their actual history together. There's even a darker layer underneath. Historians who researched their connection believe Garbo may have kept Dietrich's silence by threatening to expose her connection to a communist spy, the kind of accusation that in 1940s Hollywood would have ended a career overnight. Both women stayed silent on the subject until the day they died. Even their mutual silence told a story. But while Garbo was protecting that secret, she was building a new one entirely. 3. Greta Garbo and Mercedes de Acosta. Mercedes de Acosta began her volatile on-and-off romance with Greta Garbo in 1931, and calling it complicated would be an understatement. Garbo was the most elusive woman in Hollywood, a star who refused interviews, refused explanations, and built an entire persona out of mystery. De Acosta broke through all of it. Their connection was described by those who witnessed it as obsessive, intense, and impossible for either of them to fully walk away from. For years they circled each other, drawn together, pulling apart, returning again. Garbo once described her private affairs as exciting secrets. DaCosta was not content to keep it that way. Her 1960 memoir, Here Lies the Heart, is now considered part of gay history for the way it hinted at the lesbian element within her most significant relationships. Garbo was furious. She had spent decades constructing an impenetrable wall around her private life, and DaCosta had just handed the world a sledgehammer. The two never fully reconciled. And yet, the letters between them, the intensity, the longing, the recurring gravitational pull, suggested something that neither woman could bring herself to fully deny or fully claim. Meanwhile, across town, a completely different kind of story was beginning to unfold. 4. Tallulah Bankhead and Billie Holiday. Tallulah Bankhead was the daughter of an Alabama senator, the most scandalous woman in Hollywood, and the last person you would expect to find deeply, passionately connected to the Queen of Jazz. But that is exactly what happened. The two women likely first crossed paths in Harlem in the early 1930s, but their relationship didn't fully ignite until the late 1940s, when both were performing in New York, Holiday at the Strand Theater, Bankhead starring in a Broadway play just around the corner. Bankhead reportedly caused a commotion every night, thundering late down the aisle during Holiday's show to take her special seat and stare in amazement at the gifted Lady Day. What started as admiration became something far more intense. According to biographer Joe Lobenthal, the two had a longer-term arrangement that went well beyond friendship. And when Holiday was arrested on drug charges, Bankhead didn't just send flowers. She personally reached out to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to try to exonerate her, calling in every favor available to her. But when Holiday's ghost-written autobiography threatened to mention their relationship by name, Bankhead panicked. She hired a lawyer, threatened a lawsuit, and Holiday, furious, sent her a letter that became one of the most revealing documents in hidden Hollywood history, pointing out that she had tried to reach Bankhead 6 times to discuss it and never once got through. When Holiday died in 1959, Bankhead sent roses for her casket. The card read simply, "God bless you, love." Some things don't need much more than that, but Billie Holiday wasn't the only woman Tallulah was hiding. 5. Tallulah Bankhead and Hattie McDaniel. Hattie McDaniel made history in 1940 when she became the first black woman to win an Academy Award, taking home the Oscar for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. What history doesn't typically put next to that fact is her alleged connection to the most unapologetically wild woman in Hollywood. According to Hollywood Underground chronicler Kenneth Anger, Bankhead and McDaniel had a one-time affair. The two moved in overlapping circles. Both were larger-than-life personalities, in an industry that tolerated neither of them easily, one for her race, one for her refusal to conform. McDaniel was married 4 times, projecting the image the studios expected. The Netflix series Hollywood dramatized the implied relationship between the two, and while much of that series takes liberties, the historical precedent for women of the sewing circle era maintaining these hidden connections is well established. Bankhead herself never denied or confirmed it. But then, Bankhead rarely bothered denying anything. She once famously said that her father warned her about men and alcohol, not women and drugs. What happened between her and McDaniel behind the gates of the Garden of Allah stays in the shadow of what both women chose to leave unsaid. And Bankhead wasn't the only one with a complicated relationship with the woman behind the camera. 6. Joan Crawford and Dorothy Arzner. Dorothy Arzner was the only woman directing feature films in Hollywood during the Golden Age. She wore tailored suits, men's ties, and kept her hair cropped short at a time when that alone could end a career. Though discreet about her private life, Arzner's obvious identity within the community gained her acceptance as one of the boys, while she was simultaneously linked romantically to some of the biggest names in the business, including Joan Crawford, Billy Burke, and Ona Munson. The Crawford connection is particularly layered. Arzner directed Crawford twice in 1937. And Crawford once claimed, "I think all my directors fell in love with me. I know Dorothy Arzner did." Whether that was ego, confession, or a little of both is anyone's guess. What is clear is that the two women maintained a close relationship for years, with historians noting that Crawford's biographers treated the connection as going well beyond professional admiration. The singular and documented love of Arzner's life was choreographer Marion Morgan, with whom she shared a 4-decade relationship. But the pull toward Crawford, and what Crawford's own behavior suggests about her attraction to women, makes this one of the most quietly compelling pairings of the entire era. And Crawford's connections to women didn't stop there. 7. Joan Crawford and Barbara Stanwyck. Joan Crawford was one of the most photographed, most publicized, and most carefully managed stars in MGM history, and yet even MGM couldn't contain all of her story. Among the women she was romantically linked to was Barbara Stanwyck, a connection that reportedly began when both women frequented the same speakeasies in the 1920s, where Tallulah Bankhead was also a regular. In her prime, Crawford was linked to multiple women, including Alice Delamar, Martha Ray, Dorothy Arzner, and Claudette Colbert. The connection with Stanwyck has particular weight. Two of Hollywood's most iron-willed women, both widely believed by historians to have preferred women, circling each other in a world that gave them no room to say so openly. MGM paid $100,000 in 1935 to suppress the release of a film featuring Crawford in a compromising context at the age of 19. The studio machine worked overtime to manage her image. What Crawford actually wanted, and who, was a different story entirely. And the same was true of Stanwyck, whose own studio had an even more drastic plan in mind. That plan involved a wedding nobody actually wanted. 8. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor. Barbara Stanwyck's biographer, Axel Madsen, once described her as the most famous lesbian in the closet in Hollywood. Actor Clifton Webb reportedly called her his favorite Hollywood lesbian, and her then-husband Robert Taylor reportedly told actress Shelley Winters over dinner that Stanwyck was a lesbian and that they slept in separate beds. The marriage itself is one of the most documented cases of studio intervention in classic Hollywood history. When it became clear to MGM that the private lives of both Stanwyck and Taylor could no longer be contained, the studio called them both in for a meeting. The conclusion was a marriage, a last-ditch effort to protect two careers at once. They married on May 13, 1939. After the ceremony, Taylor refused to kiss his new bride and went home to spend the night at his mother's house. The union lasted on paper for 18 years, but was reportedly over in substance within months. Both continued living their own lives behind the scenes, while in public they remained one of Hollywood's most photographed couples. The studio got what it wanted. The two stars got their careers. And the truth got buried until the biographers and historians started digging decades later. But if Stanwyck's situation was bleak, the other Catherine, with a C, had an arrangement even more elaborate. 9. Katharine Hepburn and Phyllis Wilburn. Katharine Hepburn was, by almost every account, one of the most fiercely independent women Hollywood ever produced. She wore trousers on the studio lot before it was remotely acceptable, refused to play the publicity game, and declined to remarry after her brief early divorce. Her inner circle was almost entirely composed of women: Laura Barney Harding, Constance Collier, Eve March, Frances Rich, and the woman who would stay closest of all, Phyllis Wilburn. Wilburn came into Hepburn's life as a companion and assistant, and never really left. When Wilburn died, she was buried in the Hepburn family plot. Hepburn herself once referred to Wilburn as "my Alice B. Toklas," a reference to the lifelong partner of Gertrude Stein, one of the most famous lesbian couples in literary history. Some biographers argue that Hepburn loved Wilburn for decades, and quietly encouraged the myth of her romance with Spencer Tracy to keep the real story out of print. Their bond lasted nearly 30 years. Whether it was romantic in the conventional sense may be beside the point. By every measure that matters, presence, devotion, permanence, Phyllis Wilborn was the most consistent relationship of Katharine Hepburn's life. And the relationship everyone thought was her greatest love? That's a different story entirely. 10. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. For decades, the romance between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy was treated as one of the great love stories in Hollywood history. They made 9 films together. The public adored them. Biographers wrote entire books about their bond, and underneath all of it was a story the studios had carefully constructed, and both stars spent years maintaining. Veteran writer Larry Kramer stated publicly that Hepburn and Tracy were both gay, and that they were publicly paired together by the movie studio, adding that everyone in Hollywood knows this is true. Multiple biographers have since documented the likelihood that both were primarily attracted to their own gender, and that the Hepburn-Tracy romance functioned as mutual cover, giving each of them the heterosexual love story the studio system demanded. Tracy reportedly pursued his own interests. Hepburn maintained Phyllis Wilborn's constant presence, and the two stars appeared together at enough public events to give audiences exactly what they came for. It was, by most accounts, one of the greatest performances either of them ever gave, and it was never captured on film. Meanwhile, on the other side of Hollywood, another first was hiding a secret of her own. 11. Janet Gaynor and Margaret Lindsay. Janet Gaynor made history as the first woman to ever win the Academy Award for Best Actress, and the only person ever to win it for multiple roles in a single ceremony. She was beloved, wholesome, and one of the most bankable stars of the early sound era. She was also, according to almost everyone who knew the industry from the inside, quietly in love with women. In 1933, Gaynor worked on a film called Patty the Next Best Thing, where she met actress Margaret Lindsay. Lindsay never married, and most who knew her assumed she was gay. Gaynor and Lindsay remained close for years, and some believed that Gaynor's subsequent marriage was a smokescreen to hide a relationship with Lindsay that she couldn't acknowledge publicly. Lindsay, when she needed a date for a red carpet event, would turn to gay friends like Cesar Romero and Liberace, rather than maintain any pretense of a heterosexual relationship. The two women's friendship and alleged romance exists mostly in the space between what was said and what was carefully not said, which, in classic Hollywood, was often where the real story lived. And the arrangement Gaynor made next would take the concept of a hidden life to an entirely new level. 12. Janet Gaynor and Mary Martin. Janet Gaynor's second marriage, to MGM costume designer Adrian, is one of the most documented lavender marriages in Hollywood history. Adrian was openly gay within the film community, and Gaynor was widely rumored to be gay or bisexual. Together, they provided cover for each other, and somehow the arrangement lasted 20 years. But the more quietly extraordinary connection was with actress and Broadway legend Mary Martin, who also happened to be in her own suspected lavender marriage. Gaynor and Martin's husbands were both openly gay within their circles, and the four traveled together extensively, including purchasing adjoining ranches in Brazil where they could live with more freedom than Hollywood allowed. It was Mary Martin who was in the car with Gaynor when they were hit by another vehicle in San Francisco in 1982, the crash that caused injuries Gaynor never fully recovered from, and which ultimately led to her death 2 years later. The two women, who had spent decades constructing elaborate parallel lives to survive in an industry that gave them no other option, were together at the end when it mattered most. Whether their bond was romantic or something even harder to name than that, it lasted longer and ran deeper than almost any of the official love stories Hollywood put their names on. The studios built the closet. They drafted the contracts, arranged the marriages, hired the fixers, paid the hush money, and shaped every headline. They were extraordinarily good at it. But what they didn't anticipate, what they could never fully control, was the world these women built inside that closet, a world of connection, loyalty, passion, and in some cases, genuine love. The sewing circle wasn't just a secret society. It was a survival network for women who had no other way to be who they were. And the real story of classic Hollywood isn't the one on the screen. It's the one happening just outside the frame. These 12 couples were just the ones history managed to recover. Think about how many more there are that no one ever found.